MSc from Science College, University of Calcutta, and PhD from Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. Past, he has done his PhD from Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. Then he was a guest scientist as IFW Dresden, and then visiting scientist in Germany, then Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship in Germany. 2007 to 8, he was visiting scientist IFW Dresden, Germany. 2006 to 9, he was an honorary DAD visitor for promoting Indo-German relations in education. 2010 to 12, faculty TCIS Hyderabad, Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, India, and 2012-14, visiting scientist George August University, Göttingen, Germany. His research topic mainly topological insulators, semi-metals, superconductivity, spatial attention to Fe-based systems, chalcogenides, etc. Correlated electron system, manganese, and Kondo phenomenon, properties at the surface and interfaces, electronic structure of thin films and multilayers, semiconductor nanostructures, and diluted magnetic semiconductor. He has been awarded with many prestigious medals and fellowships like P.K. Iyer Memorial Award for Excellence in Experimental Physics 2018, Fellow of Indian National Academy of Science, New Delhi 2016, DAE Science Research Council Outstanding Investigator Award 2014, J.C. Bose Fellowship 2014, Fellow of National Academy of Science, India, Allahabad 2012, Swanti Swarup Bhatnagar in 2010, Fellow of the Indian Academy of Science, Bangalore 2010, Rajiv Goyal Prize for Young Scientist in Physics 2016, B.M. Birla Science Prize in Physics 2006, Swarna Jayanti Fellowship 2005 to 6, title Honorary DAD Visitor 2006 to 9 for outstanding commitment and leadership promoting Indo-German relation in education, award of the President of Federal Republic of Germany, Young Achievers Award, Department of Atomic Energy, Government of India 2005, Young Physical Society First Award for the Young Physicist of the Year 2002, P.K. Basu Memorial Award 2002, Alexander von Humboldt Fellowship 1999, 2000, Trausle Medal for the Best Thesis, Indian Institute of Science, Indo-German Fellowship, DLR, Germany, and many more. Now I invite Professor Maiti, Kalaburun Maiti, to give his lecture. It's up to, stage is yours, Professor Maiti. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chakraborty. So thanks for your kind introduction. And first of all, I like to thank Professor Om Prakash Sinha ji for kindly inviting to give this talk. Unfortunately, he had to face some tragedy and he could not come. I'm very sorry to hear that. And I wish him and his family all the best so that he can cope with this and come out of it very fast. So I think usually it's always a pleasure to visit personally to the institutions and so on. But in this kind of conditions, often it becomes difficult. But at the same time, it has not really stopped interacting among us. So this is a very nice way of interacting with people who really and keep in touch with various things. So, and I'm happy that I've been invited to give this talk. I think I visited Amity University once during this DAE symposium. It's a very nice campus and very nice to see so many things are happening. So today, I would like to give a brief introduction about photoelectron spectroscopy that we use for our research activity. So before I go into the topic, so I would like to acknowledge all my students and postdocs who has been instrumental to the success of this activity. As you know that you need to have a very brilliant manpower to support such kind of a research activity. And I have been happy to have many such brilliant students and postdocs who has contributed in this kind of studies. So these are the people who completed their PhD. These are the people who has worked with us as a postdoctoral fellow, and there are some JRFs who completed their PhD and doing the jobs or other things. At present, the group is like this. There are 4 students. One is registered somewhere else at University of Slovenia, and others are registered at TIFR, and these are the postdocs. And the scientific officer who has been the really main backbone for the laboratory, who has been supporting us maintaining the lab. Okay, so let's get into the topic. Photoelectron spectroscopy. So today what I'll do is that I'll try to give a brief overview about the technique, so that any non-expert, so they would be able to follow it, what I'm trying to say. So if you have studied a little bit of photoelectric effect and so on, not really much big physics, so I hope you will be able to follow it. In case there is any question or anything, you please stop me, and I'll be happy to answer. So photoelectron spectroscopy is based on photoelectric effect, so which of course got explained by Einstein theoretically, and he got Nobel Prize for that. So the effect is such that you have a material and you shine light on this, and this light of course will get absorbed by the electrons inside the material. The energy range that I'm talking about is 10 to 20 electron volt to this few kilo electron volt, which essentially is relevant for the energy scale of the electrons in a material. Normally, if you want to probe the nucleus or other kind of excitations, you need much higher. So we are basically limited to the energy of the electrons inside the solid. Okay? So once the light falls, the electron will absorb this photon energy, and if the energy is high enough so that the electron can leave the binding with the solid, so it comes out of the material. And you put a detector and try to detect these electrons. So this is basically the process. As I said, you all know that Einstein got Nobel Prize in 1921. So this theory was given in about 10 years back. So followed by that, this technique has been creating revolutions on various studies. For example, Carl Zygmunt, so he used this technique to identify elements. For example, like if you want to find out certain element present in certain material, so you can use X-ray spectroscopy, for which he got Nobel Prize. He is from Uppsala University. And later, his son, who is Kai Zygmunt, so he also worked in the same university where his father worked, and he got Nobel Prize in 1981 for the discovery of this electron spectroscopy, which today many people call it XPS, X-ray photoelectron spectroscopy. And the physicist who used this technique, of course, calls the same technique in different names, which I'll explain today. So basically, this is a wonderful technique which can be utilized to detect various properties of the material or its constituent elements without destroying the material. I mean, most of the time, if you want to understand what is there in a material, you try to do chemical analysis and so on. But this is a technique which can be used to detect all the informations of a material without destroying it. So that's the reason it's so powerful and very widely used by many people. So slowly I'll get into the subject, whatever can be done by this technique. Now let's look at what actually happens. So you are putting lots of photons on this sample, and electron absorbs that photon energy. Now you know that the electrons, they have energy depending on which energy level they are in. For example, if you have oxygen inside the material, then there is oxygen 1s, oxygen 2s, then oxygen 2p, and so on. And if you have, say, iron, then of course you have 1s, 2s, 2p, like the core levels. And the electrons which are at the highest occupied level, that's called the valence level. So this is, for example, the core levels of certain element, and this is the valence level. This EF is called the Fermi level, which is the highest occupied level in the electronic structure. So above this, all the energy levels which are there, they are unoccupied level, or they are called conduction band, and the ones which are occupied, they are called valence band. Now, if an electron wants to come out of the material, so it has to overcome some potential barrier. So the amount of energy that is required to come out of this material is called the work function. So that's represented by EV, the vacuum energy. So if an electron has this much energy, so then it can actually escape the material. So now you can see that if the energy of the photon that is falling on the sample is h nu, so the electron energy will be elevated by that energy. For example, if an electron is there at this energy, it will get elevated to this level. If the electron is here, its energy will get enhanced to this energy. Now, any energy which is above this vacuum level, so that will become the kinetic energy of that electron, which comes out of the material, and you will be able to detect those electrons. So basically, you are detecting electrons which has an energy higher than this vacuum energy level. And you basically try to detect the kinetic energy and momentum of these electrons using this detector. Okay. Now let's look at what exactly we detect by this detector. So if I assume that the intensity or the number of electrons you are detecting by this detector, and the electron kinetic energy is epsilon. Okay, so this depends on many parameters, okay, which are involved in this photo emission process. Okay, so the first parameter that I'll explain this later again, is called sigma E, which is the photo emission cross section. It means that the moment you put this light and the electron gets excited, it's a quantum mechanical process, means that you are exciting an electron from one energy level to another energy level. So this excitation has a transition probability. Okay. So photo emission cross section actually is a factor which depends on this transition probability. Okay. And the next factor, which is called R epsilon, R is the resolution function. So any detector or any experimental method that we use, there is an accuracy by which you can detect a particular parameter. So the R or the resolution function actually determines the accuracy by which you can detect. For example, if you want to detect an electron of 5 electron volt, it's not necessary the detector is getting electrons of the energy of 5.00000 electron volt. There will be electrons which are of slightly different energy reaches the detector and you are detecting them. Now the question is that how much accuracy is there in your detection process? So that actually is typically like a Gaussian function, and usually the width of that Gaussian is used as a measure of resolution or the accuracy that by which we detect these electrons. Okay? The next factor is called the lifetime broadening function or Lorentzian function. So why this comes into the picture? The moment you are exciting an electron from one of the level, so this electron create an empty state here, and the electrons gets excited to a higher energy level. Okay. Now, as I said, that since this is a quantum mechanical excitation process, so all the conservation laws, like the total energy is conserved, total momentum is conserved, all these will be applicable as long as your process remains quantum mechanical. The moment it becomes classical, so you cannot really implement these kind of conservation rules. So that means that if you are creating a hole here, because of the excited hole means the absence of an electron at this level. So this kind of conservation rules will be applicable as long as this empty state is surviving. Now, if you have electrons at higher energy levels, so those electrons will try to kill this empty state or hole. So if that hole is killed or destroyed, then the system doesn't remain quantum mechanical anymore, and you cannot implement these laws. Okay, so your detection of electrons and the rules that you are applying to detect it will be valid as long as the hole is surviving here. At the same time, the electron that you have excited here to the higher energy level, it will not survive for infinite time, because there are many energy levels empty below this energy level. So it will try to relax and go to the lower energy state. Okay, that's normally the process. The moment it loses its energy and going to the lower energy state, so this system again loses its quantum character, or the laws that we are talking about will not be valid. So this whole lifetime is also an important factor. So this Lorentzian function that I'm talking about, taking care of the lifetime of the system, is actually taking care of the lifetime of the electrons and the holes getting created by this photoexcitation process. Okay. Now the third, this term, this fourth term, this exponential e to the power minus x over lambda, is another important factor. So if you are exciting an electron at a certain depth from the surface, so this electron gets activated, so the energy gets elevated, and it will try to come out of the material. Now it's not necessary that all the electrons which are getting excited will come out of the material, because when it's coming out, it can experience some amount of inelastic scattering processes. For example, you know, there are lots of atoms above this site where the excitation has happened. So in case this electron gets lost or lose its energy due to various scattering processes which are happening inside the solid, then this electron energy is no longer satisfying the kind of conservation rules that we have talked about. So this electron is lost from the signal. So the electrons which are coming out of the material without any inelastic loss, so those are basically the signal that we are detecting and corresponds to the photoexcitation process that we are associating with. Okay. So that means that some fraction of the electron that we are exciting at a depth from the surface will get lost, and lambda is the mean escape depth of the electrons that comes out of the material. So the fraction of the electron that comes out by this excitation process is actually contributing to your signal. And the final thing is the density of states, called loss, that we basically want to measure. So our aim is essentially to find out how many electrons are there at different energy level, whether it's a core level or a valence state. So you basically want to find out how many electrons are there. So this factor is represented in your photoemission spectrum, but this is not the only thing that you need to worry about when you are looking at the photoemission spectrum and interpreting it. So there are many other factors which are there that you need to worry about. Okay? So that's the thing which I wanted to say. There are other important points that I would come across slowly. So just keep in mind that you have a material where n number of electrons present, and now you are shining the sample with some light which has an energy h nu. So if an electron comes out, so what is happening? You are detecting this electron, and it has left n minus 1 electrons inside the material. So what you are doing is that by determining the properties of this electron and employing various excitation, various conservation rules, you essentially try to understand the property of this n minus 1 particles that you are looking at. So that's basically the process which is happening. Now, another point which I want to mention here is that these excitations that you are having due to this photo absorption, it's an extremely fast process. The time scale of this process is of the order of say 10 raised to minus 18 second or so. It's called attosecond. So it's happening so fast that you are not allowing the system to relax before you actually have executed the process. So it's more like taking a snapshot. So you are sitting with a fast camera and people are standing in front of you. So even if people are not really extremely static, there are some movements happening, you are able to take the picture of the people in front of you, and that gives you a very nice image of the system that you have. So it gives you a local electronic structure of the system. So it's like an image collection of the system, which is there during the excitations without having much disturbance inside the material influencing your process. Okay, so that's extremely important thing that needs to be kept in mind. So it means that the electronic structure that you are probing, or the energy, the intensity that you are finding out from this process, represents the local electronic structure of the system. Because it's local, it's because you are not allowing the system to evolve so that it readjusts itself and changes the electronic structure of the system. Okay, so that's the very important point. Okay. Now let's go over to what actually you can learn by this technique. Okay, so I'll go one by one, different processes, so different terms which influences your process. So the first thing is that this intensity, it depends on the photoemission cross-section. So let's discuss about that. So this photoemission cross-section, which is sigma E, actually can be represented by this term. Okay, so if you are not familiar with quantum mechanics or electronic transition, don't worry about this. I'll not talk much equations and so on beyond this. So just keep in mind that the electrons which we are exciting by this photoexcitation process, it was in an quantum state which is represented by psi I, which is the initial state. And after excitations, it has got into an electronic state which we call eigenstate, we call psi F. Now, what is the transition probability? That is determined by Fermi's Golden Rule. So which is basically an expectation value of psi I and psi F. And this A is the vector potential that is coming because of the perturbation due to light. Okay, so that much only the quantum thing that I am going to talk, not more than that. So basically, if you take this matrix element and take the square of it, so your photoemission cross section will be directly proportional to that. And this one is called the Dirac delta function. So this epsilon I is the initial energy level of the electron from where you are exciting the electron, and epsilon F is the final energy of the electron. So this difference of energy, epsilon F minus epsilon I, if it is equal to the photon energy that you have used to excite the electron, then you have the transition. So this delta function is 1 when this epsilon F minus epsilon I equal to h nu, or this whole thing inside the bracket is 0. Otherwise, the whole thing is 0. Okay, so that ensures the energy conservation. Okay. As I said, that it's a quantum mechanical process. So this Dirac delta function ensures the energy conservation. So the energy of the photon is equal to the energy separation between the initial state and final state. So this can be expressed as the binding energy of the electron. Binding energy essentially is it's not really defined in terms of the zero of energy set at the infinity or infinite distance from the system. Normally in solid state physics, we assume that the highest occupied level or the Fermi level is the zero of your energy. So that's the way you take your reference energy. So binding energy is defined with respect to that highest occupied level. And then phi is the work function. So then the kinetic energy that we have shown here, the additional energy which comes out of this photon, which is the kinetic energy of the electron that we detect. Okay, basically the E binding energy plus E kinetic energy plus the work function is your total photon energy that we have used. So that comes from this energy conservation. Now, since we know the photon energy, we can determine the work function, and we are determining the binding kinetic energy of the electron by our experiment. So from these three quantities, we can actually determine the binding energy. So that's the way we are finding out the binding energy of the electron that comes out. You can use the momentum conservation law and find out the momentum of the electron before excitations in the solid by measuring the momentum of the electron that has come out of the solid. I'll tell you more details a little bit about this later. You can also detect by experiment the spin of the electron that comes out, and also determine the symmetry. It means that what kind of symmetry it has when it was in the solid, because the symmetry doesn't change. So if you have a mirror symmetry or if you have a rotational symmetry inside the solid, so this symmetry will not change when you are exciting an electron from the occupied state to somewhere outside. So that way, since the symmetry is preserved, because there is nothing that really disturbs the symmetry, so you can actually learn by detecting the electron, the symmetry of the initial state that it has come out. So basically, what I want to say is that you can determine the energy, the momentum, the spin, and symmetry, all the four quantities of an electron inside the solid, which is required to know anything, everything about the electron structure in a solid. So this is one of the most powerful and the only technique by which you can actually get all these four quantities, which are called the four quantum numbers in a solid for the electronic structure. Like, for example, if you have an atom, so if you know all the four quantum numbers like principal quantum number, azimuthal quantum number, and spin, and so all these orbital moments, so then you know everything about the electronic structure of an atom. Similarly, in a solid, so you can know everything about the electronic structure and electronic properties if you know all these four quantities. And the good thing is that you can determine them experimentally. So that's the main important point. Now let's talk about how to utilize different properties to understand the material properties. Okay, let's talk about this matrix element. How you can learn about the system just from this matrix. So, as I said, that this is the sigma E, or the photo emission cross section, depends on this transition probability. Now, you see that you have an electron which is at an initial state, and you have used a photon energy of the order of say 20 electron volt to say 10 kilo electron volt to excite the electron from this initial energy state to final state. Now, since it has come out of the material and the energy is very high, so you basically can treat this electron which has come out is like a free electron. So free electron means that their properties or the frequency of oscillation will depend on its kinetic energy, but they are basically free from the solid. Okay, so it will not really have anything to do with the solid. If that is the case, so you can imagine that this photo emission cross section actually helps you to know about the property of the initial state, because the final state is a 3 electron state. Okay. So this is something that can be utilized like as if the initial state derives the photo emission signal. Okay. This kind of impression that we can get. Let's look at what we can learn. Now I am actually looking at the valence band or the highest occupied energy band of a system by using photo excitation. So what I have done, I have used 3 different photon energies and looked at the same energy band. Okay? So this is the highest occupied band. This 0 is your highest Fermi level or the highest occupied level. Now if you look at the spectrum using this photon energy, so you see you get a curve like this. It has some peaks like that. Now if you change the photon energy, it shows a spectrum of the same thing, but it looks very different. Now you change the photon energy to a very high energy, the system becomes significantly different, the lines. So you see that it looks like that as if that you are looking at the same object, but using different kind of specs, and the appearance to you becomes different. It gives you some kind of an information which is extremely important that we can learn just from this by doing this experiment. So what we notice is that if you look at this 21.2 electron volt, you see this peak that becomes extremely intense if you go to this energy. But this peak which was there at the middle, it almost becomes non-existent when you go to this X-ray source, okay, X-ray spectrum. But this peak again becomes very strong. So the relative intensity of peaks are changing. Now, we know that the photo emission cross section, that sigma E that we have talked about, is intimately linked to the signal intensity that we are looking at it. So if we calculate it, we can use various tables for photo emission cross sections, which has been calculated and found out. We know that if you excite an electron from, say, d electronic state, so the intensity corresponding cross section at, say, X-ray energy is much higher for the d states compared to, say, p states. But if you are at lower energy, p states, the oxygen p states become much more intense compared to the d states. So this is the material that we have looked at. The material is called BaIrO3. So barium, iridium oxide. So you have iridium, you have oxygen, you have barium. So the conduction band or valence band is constituted by iridium d states and oxygen p states. Now, since we know that at this energy from our calculation, that the oxygen 2p states are more intense compared to the d states, so you can immediately say that this peak must be corresponding to oxygen 2. Okay. Now you go to X-ray photon energy where the iridium d states become more intense. So you can say from this behavior that must be this peak, and this peak has a strong contribution from iridium d, but they are also contributed by oxygen p. Okay. So now you know that in a material, like if you have a molecule or if you have a solid, always the conduction band is a hybridized state where the iridium d and oxygen p, they are hybridized, and you have, if you have a hybridization, you have bonding states, you have anti-bonding states. So from this behavior, you can say that this actually is the bonding state, and this is the anti-bonding state, because the bonding state comes at higher binding energy away from the Fermi level, and the anti-bonding state comes at lower binding energy. And this in-between states where the D is almost not there must be the oxygen P states which are not bonded to anyone. Or you can say that these are probably the non-bonding states. Okay? So this you can learn. Now, you know that the bonding and anti-bonding states usually are represented by this kind of scenario. For example, think of a hydrogen molecule. So you have a hydrogen 1s level, you have another hydrogen 1s level. If you have a bonding state, so which is like, say, psi1x, which is the hydrogen 1, and psi2x is the hydrogen 2, the 1s state. So the bonding is like this, psi1 plus psi2, and the anti-bonding is psi1 minus psi2, because they are orthonormal to each other. Okay, and their energies are like this. Okay, but so you can say that, of course, this is the bonding, which is this. This one is the anti-bonding, it's this. But you can see that the change of intensity in these two peaks, they are not same. For example, this peak has changed significantly stronger compared to this peak. Okay, so this says that this state might be more contributed by your iridium D compared to this one. So this doesn't say that actually both are equally contributed by both the states. So this one is more like iridium D, this one is less like iridium D, more like oxygen P. So the scenario will not be like this. So you can immediately draw a different kind of scenario which would look like this, as if that this scenario can be explained like this, that you have oxygen 2p state and iridium D states, their energies are not at the same level. So this one might be higher compared to this. So that the anti-bonding that you have is actually more contributed by iridium B, so which can be expressed by this, and the bonding is more contributed by oxygen B. So that's the way you can learn about their hybridization, their contribution. So which state has which kind of symmetry, which kind of orbitals and so on, just by looking at this kind of photoemission spectrum using different photon energies and comparing them with the photoemission cross section. Okay, so far so good. But the photoemission process is actually not so simple. Okay. So this is one way of actually understanding the energy band spectrum. But let's go beyond this. As I said, let's think about the process in a slightly different way. Okay. Initially, when I said that talked about the photoemission process, so what we said is that the system or the material, you have n electrons and you have put some photon onto the system and an electron comes out of it. So what we are doing is that, sorry. What we are doing is that in this kind of experiment, we are trying to determine the properties of this electron which has come out of the system and use various conservation rules so that the moment you know the energy of this, you can immediately know the energy of the n-1 particle system left behind, because you know that before the excitation, the system was in the ground state, the lowest energy state. So that one is not really changed. So depending on the energy that you have detected, you know all the properties. So basically you are learning the properties of this electron that has come out, and that actually gives you the properties of the n-1 particle system it has left behind in the system. Now if the electrons, they are interacting with each other, so the scenario is not so simple the way I have talked just now. Okay? Because the kind of Hamiltonian that is used to represent the system for the final state will not be same like before you have excited the electron, because electrons are interacting with each other. So the way they interact for n electrons, it will not be same when you have n-1 electrons. Okay, the things will be very different. So I'll try to schematically show what exactly happens in this process. Okay. Let's look at this. So here, I think schematically it will be more clear. So assume that your system is in the ground state where you have n electrons and you have perturbed the system by an external electromagnetic radiation, which is a photon, and an electron has come out, and you are determining the energy of this electron and learning the properties of the n-1 particle system, which this electron has left behind. Now, if the energy that you have determined, that electron, is this, and the corresponding energy of the system that it has left behind is this, so that this total energy is equal to the photon energy, okay, following the energy conservation rule. So then you get a corresponding signal. Now, if the final state of this n-1 particle system is not really this, but actually is this, so it is not at the lowest energy state, but it is at the highest energy state, because you are having an excited state. This is not necessary that this perturbed state will be only the lowest energy state. It can be any state that this electron has left behind. So if it has left behind to this state, then the electron that you are detecting, it cannot have kinetic energy this much, because the energy is conserved. Okay, so this much energy it has to lose. So the detection will correspond to the electron energy to this. So that means that here the kinetic energy is much lower, and you get a corresponding peak at a different energy position. Okay. Now, if your system has an energy which is this, then again the electron that you have detected has a kinetic energy is even lower. Okay. So basically, you can see that you are having the same excitation process from the same initial state, but if the system is at a different excitations of the final state, you get different peaks, although you are exciting from the same level. Okay, so this is more complex, and that's the thing which happens. So you have a photon energy that you have used, and this is your energy conservation law that you are using. So now the binding energy that we are determining. Now, if the kinetic energy is this, so you get a binding energy. If the kinetic energy is this, you get another binding energy. And if this one is this, you get another binding energy. So you can see that for the same excitations, for this example, you get actually 3 peaks, not really 1 peak. So this makes your system or experiment much more complex. So that means if you are probing, say, for example, oxygen 1s or say nickel 2p, and so you are exciting the same energy core level, but the experiment that you see gives you a completely different kind of spectrum, much more complex. Okay, so this is the reason photoemission is not really a process which is determined by the initial state. It's a final state that determines the spectral features. Okay, the final state in which you have left the system. So the valence band spectrum that I have talked about earlier, there also you have to consider all these scenarios that in which state it has left behind, and consider all the final states that you have, and considering that you can actually get the idea about the photoemission spectrum. I'll give you an example to explain what exactly is happening in a solid. Okay. Look at this example. So you know that nickel oxide, NiO, those who have studied solid state physics, of course you have come across to various complex materials. So this NiO here, nickel and oxygen, it forms in rock salt kind of structure. So the nickel is here and the oxygen is here, and then again nickel comes. So if an electron here, it wants to come from one nickel to another, you can see that there is a oxygen, so it can hop to this oxygen and come here. Okay. Similarly, if an electron wants to come from here to this direction, so if this is your x-axis and this is your y-axis, you can see that an electron can go from here to this one by hopping through another oxygen. If it wants to go in the z direction, you can see that the electron can hop from here to this oxygen and go here. So these electrons actually can hop in any direction in this material. So that's the reason these are called 3-dimensional kind of system or effective 3-dimensional system. Now, if you go to another compound, which is a K2NiF4 structure, which is La2NiO4, most of the cuprate superconductors, they form in this kind of structure. This is a very interesting structure. You can see that here, this nickel and oxygen octahedra, they are arranged in a 2-dimensional plane. So if an electron wants to come from here to here along x-axis, it can go here because you have a nickel here and there is an oxygen here. So it can hop through this. Similarly, if it wants to go along this y direction, it can go through this oxygen. But if it wants to go along c direction, you can see that this nickel and the next nickel is sitting here. So there is no way it can go there. So it can come to this oxygen, but then there is a lanthanum or something else, which is an ionic kind of element, La3 plus or something like that. So this one doesn't have any state at the valence band. So the electron is stuck here. It really cannot move in this c direction. So that's the reason, although these materials are 3-dimensional, but the electron actually cannot move in one direction. They are confined in the xy plane. That's the reason these are called effective 2-dimensional material. Okay. Look at this structure. This is Y2BA NiO. Here actually, these octahedra, they are connected only along one direction. So if you have an electron in this direction, okay, so they can move in this direction, but it cannot move in this, and it cannot move in this because they are not really connected by simple way. Okay, so that's the reason these are called 1-dimensional systems. And here you have these clusters. They are not really linked by some simple ways. So that means that if you have an electron which is within this cluster, it cannot come out of it. So this kind of material, you can see, this is a three-dimensional material. You have nickel, you have oxygen and everything. And there is a cluster which is forming. And this must be a highly insulating material because, sorry, the electron actually cannot move in any direction, okay? But here it can move in one direction. Usually they show insulating behavior because if you have any small defect, like say some impurity or something, the electron will get stuck. So it cannot go. So it was able to move in one direction, but eventually it gets stuck. Similarly, two-dimensional systems also often shows insulating behavior because you can actually part up the system by impurities or defects, and you don't have this movement of electrons. So the three-dimensional systems usually are good metals. But NiO is an insulator for a different reason. I'm not going into that. So now what I'm saying is that you have a nickel which is in four different environments. So this is a three-dimensional environment. This is an effective two-dimensional environment. This is one-dimensional, and this is a zero-dimensional. And I'm looking at nickel 2p photoemission spectrum. I'm just knocking out an electron from nickel 2p. And you see that from different material, the same excitations, they show completely different pictures. You see, for the same excitation, you get four distinct peaks. One is here, another is here, another is here, another is here. Okay? And the relative intensities changes depending on where they are there. You can actually explain them. I'm not going into the details of this. So what I'm trying to say is that if you are exciting an electron from a particular energy level, it's not necessary that you will get only one peak. You can get many peaks. Okay, so you actually have to consider the origin of those peaks and what are so these final states in which the system is left behind by the electron is one of the most important factors that you need to read when you are studying photoelectron spectrum. Okay, so now I go to different aspects of it. So now what we are doing is that, so again, look at the photoemission spectroscopy technique. So you have a sample and an electron that comes out of it. So what you do is that you have a detector where you have a position sensitive detector like that. So what we do, so if an electron comes out at a certain angle, we use a electrostatic lens. And say, for example, the red one represents the electron at a particular angle, theta 1. So that will be focused on your detector at one point. If an electron comes out at a different angle, you can actually focus them at a different point. So like that, you can find out the electrons coming out at different angles, at different energies. So now if you know, yeah, is there any question? Okay, so now if you know that the kinetic energy of the electron that has come out, it's like a free electron. So you can write down the kinetic energy is p square by 2m. So which is h cross square k square by 2m. Okay, and you know at which angle it's coming out. So you know the momentum of the electron. And this momentum using momentum conservation law can be actually mapped onto the crystal momentum or the reciprocal lattice vector of the system. So that way what you know is that you know the energy of the electron as a function of its momentum, and so which is called the energy band. So experimentally you can find out the energy bands by this process. Now since the determination of angle is very important along with the energy that you determine, so that's the reason it's called a RPS or angle visual potential spectroscopy. So now depending on the procedure, you have different names of the technique. The photoemission spectroscopy is called PES. Now, if you use X-ray energies to excite the photoemission, so you call it XPS, which is used extensively by chemists and biologists. So you know that you can actually find out the elements, and I'll tell you how it is, and the composition. So that is used. So if you want to identify a molecule or some binding energy of a system, so you can use this very efficiently. You can call it UPS if you are using ultraviolet photon energy. You can use laser photon energy called LPS. You can use synchrotron radiation, then it's called SRPS, VUV for ultraviolet, soft X-ray, SXPS, HAXPACE for hard X-ray, and so on. Now, depending on the resolution, you can call it HRPS, high resolution photoelectron spectroscopy, angle-resolved photoemission spectroscopy, SPPS, and so on. So all these terminologies which are used is basically depending on certain features of your technique, but the technique is the same. Now, I'll tell you how this can be used wonderfully to identify elements. Okay, so look at this spectrum. So I have collected a XPS spectrum of a material which gives you so many peaks. So now, how to identify this? Okay, so I can actually find out, as I said, that you can find out the photoemission binding energy and so on from various and calculate their photoemission cross section. So these tables are available. Okay, and it's easy to find out experimentally also. For example, if you want to find out binding energy of various core level spectrum in iron. So take a pure iron, do XPS, and find out what are the binding energy of that, and then find out their inner intensities and so on. So elemental analysis is extremely easy by experimental method as well as theory. Okay. Now, if you have an unknown material, so as you know that the binding energy of various core levels are specific to the element. Like oxygen 1's binding energy is 532 electron volt. So at this energy, you won't find binding energy of any other core levels. Even if you find, you will see that there will be other levels available which can be helped to identify this element. So from various tables, binding energy table, which is available, for example, in atomic data and nuclear data tables. So there are various tables available. You can actually identify which peak corresponds to what. Okay. So from that, I can find out that, okay, this is the valence band, this is arsenic 3D, this is calcium 3s, and iron, and so on. So that way, it's easily found that what are the elements are there. Okay. Now, how to find out how much amount is there? So from that, you can find out the composition. So to do that, you can actually do one thing is that find out the area under this curve. So you, as I said, that the intensity of the photoemission spectrum depends or proportional to the amount of element that is present in your material. So if you know the area under the curve and we multiply by the photoemission cross section and you do it for everyone, then you can find out how much element, how much amount is there. But it's not so simple because, for example, you can see that for each photoemission spectrum, for example, it's iron 2p, you can have multiple peaks. So you don't know from which energy to which energy. There is the region that you have to use for your integration. It's very uncertain. Moreover, you can see that there is a background function which comes because of the inelastic scattering that I have mentioned earlier. And the electrons which are coming out, it can experience some inelastic scattering. So they won't really contribute into the signal, but they will contribute as a background. So once you have a background, you don't know how much amount of iron is there. So this is one complication. So what we do is that, as I said, the first or immediate thing that comes to our mind is that you find out the peak intensity and get it weighted by photoemission cross section. But the problem is that you don't know the energy range of the peak, background, and cross section may vary because in your solid, the electronic states are not purely atomic states, okay? Because there is a hybridization. So once you have hybridization into the picture, so then the photoemission cross section may be very, very different from the atomic ones. But often it actually are very close to the number, so you can use them with a good approximation. The other method is that the valence. So if you know the peak position, you know that, for example, iron. So if iron has a valency 0, so it's a neutral kind of atom, then knocking out an electron, whatever energy you require, if iron is 1 plus or 2 plus, the amount of energy required to knock out electron is very, very different. You know, you need more energy because this positive charge will try to attract the electron towards itself much more. So the effective binding energy of this peak will depend on the valency. So if you are able to find out the valency or the peak position accurately from so the valency, so from valency itself you can actually tell what is the composition. But again, there are issues because you can have multiple valency in a material. For example, iron can be in 2+ or 3+. Often materials are not purely ionic, there are covalency. So if there is a covalency, then you don't know exactly what would be the exact number of elements just from the valency. And of course, there are final state effects I showed you in nickel. So you can see that there are complications. But now what you have to do is that to find out the composition, you can use both of them judiciously and find out or determine the spectrum. So this is the reason, actually this is called, the technique is called ESCA, electron spectroscopy for chemical analysis, okay? That was originally discovered by Kai Zygmunt, who got Nobel Prize for that. And you can see that I said that you don't need to destroy your material, just put inside the spectrometer and look at the spectra. And from that you can find out what is this material and various other things. But so most of the chemists and biologists use this technique for this kind of purposes. But you can actually do a lot of other things. The physicists, they try to find out the electronic properties using this technique. I'll give you a few examples, but before that, I'll just tell you one more important point, which I have talked about earlier, that this electron escape depth is a very, very important parameter, the lambda that I have talked about. So all the electrons that you're exciting that cannot come out of the material because of this inelastic scattering. So if you measure the number of electrons that could come out, you can see that it depends on the kinetic energy. So if the electron has extremely very low energy, they don't have enough energy to lose by the scattering processes, so they can come out quite easily. So at low energy, the effective escape depth is quite large. But if you increase the energy, it reduces, and at some point it becomes lower. But then the energy, when it becomes higher, so that it's so fast moving away from the element that it doesn't have enough time to lose its energy. So then again, the escape depth can be larger. Okay, so that way, the photoemission escape depth, or you can say the mean free path of the electron, actually depends on the kinetic energy of the electrons, and you have the minimum mean free path is at the energy between 40 to 100 electron volt. So once you know this, you see this is a extremely important parameter. So you can do your experiment at different kinetic energy of electrons, and you know that they are coming out from different depths. So you can learn what is the electronic structure at different depths. So what is the surface electronic structure, what is the bulk electronic structure, and so on. So this is one technique that tells you the electronic structure at different levels of the material, which is impossible to find out from other kind of technique. Now, in this curve, you can see that the escape depth of the electron at this minimum point is about, say, 6 angstrom. So 6 angstrom means that the electrons that are leaving out of the material, so if I assume that one layer is of the order of, say, 1.5 to 2 angstrom, so that means that you are actually probing 2 to 3 atomic layers from the top surface. So whatever material that you are studying, you are only probing top few layers. Now, if you go at 1.5 keV, maybe the escape depth is 20 angstrom, which is 10 layers and so on. So that means that your material that you are studying, it has to be extremely clean. The top surface has to be clean. Otherwise, anything that you are detecting is actually the top layers. Now, if you have a material in air, so it takes about 10⁻⁻⁶ seconds, okay, to deposit one layer of oxygen on top of the surface. So if you assume that the oxygens which are hitting the surface of the material get stuck, which is called the sticking coefficient. So if the sticking coefficient is 1, then it takes only 10⁻⁶ seconds to create a layer of impurity. So you can see that anything that you have in air, you cannot really study by photoemission process because you have many layers of impurities which are there. And if you do photoemission, you are getting signal only from the impurity layers. So what you need to do? So your spectrometer then needs to follow certain kind of conditions. So you need an ultra high vacuum system. So the kind of vacuum that we use for our experiment is about 10 raised to minus 14 atmosphere. So you have to use vacuum pumps of extremely high power, like the turbo pumps, which is, I mean, as powerful as like the engines that use in various aircrafts and so on. So it's extremely powerful pump, which takes out molecules from your system. So if you think of the Avogadro number, 10 raised to 23 number in normal atmospheric pressure in for some 22.4 liters of air. So you reduce that by 10 raised to 14 times. So you have about 10 raised to 9 atoms or molecules which are there inside the material. So the probability of contaminating the surface becomes very, very low. Okay? So you can say that you reduce the, the contaminating proceed by say 10 raised to 14 times. So if you multiply by 10 raised to minus 6, which takes about say to create one layer. So then you can actually keep your sample surface once you have cleaned inside this kind of vacuum, very, very long time. So maybe a day or so to do your experiment. So you need extremely high vacuum system, and you have to have a sample preparation facility which cleans your sample surface, characterize it inside the ultra high vacuum chamber so that you have a clean surface to do your experiment. This is the spectrometer that we have designed and built at TIFR. This machine, so we are happy that this could be built using the local facilities like the companies in India, and that actually now producing various ultra high vacuum systems and even exporting outside India, so to even the first world countries and so on. So it's good that the country has produced ultra high vacuum technology well after effort that we have done together. And the speciality of this kind of spectrometer that we have built here is that we can determine the energy of the electron at an extremely high accuracy. Okay? The accuracy that we have got best is close to about 1 milli electron volt. This is one very important point that I'll tell you. If I give you, I think I have already crossed quite a long time. So I'll quickly give you some examples. So why this accuracy is important? The good thing is that this is the best kind of resolution achieved anywhere in the world. So this is the only machine that is there in the country at present. And it's the first one, of course. And this is comparable to the best spectrometer available anywhere in the world, the big labs that we have. Okay. I'll now quickly tell you some of the examples that can be studied where you need this kind of energy resolution. Dr. Chakraborty, how long I can speak? Hello? Yeah, how long I can speak? Is it okay if I continue for some more time? I can't hear you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir, you can.
I can?
Take another 5-10 minutes.
Yes, sir, you can.
Okay, maybe a little bit more, but I'll try to.
Yeah, you carry on.
Okay.
Yeah, you can take it for 15 minutes, sir. You have a 15 minutes.
Okay. Okay, thanks a lot. Thank you.
Welcome.
Okay, so I'll now give you some examples because I said that how this spectroscopy, I told you this power of this kind of technique and how can it be used by chemists and biologists to identify elements, their valencies and so on, which is extremely useful because many people talk about drug delivery, producing various nanomaterials for various applications and so on. So what is the valence states of those kind of elements that you require? So these are used So this technique is used effectively to find out those properties. But now, what a physicist can do, I'll tell you very quickly. So this is a very interesting material, barium iridium oxide. Okay, so this form in this kind of structure. As I said, that the structure is such that the electron can move in this direction because there is a hopping possibility, and it cannot move in any other direction. Now, if you measure the resistivity, you know Ohm's law, that if you apply a voltage, the current is proportional to the voltage applied across the material. Okay, so that means if you plot the current as a function of voltage, it should give you a straight line. Most of the material that gives you that kind of behavior. But this material, this is highly insulating because the energy gap is expected from the resistivity measurements and so on quite large. But if you measure the current as a function of voltage applied, it shows an interesting temperature dependence. If you are at room temperature, as if that the Ohm's law is satisfied. But if you go below say 170 Kelvin, you can see the curve looks like this. So look at the curve at 120 Kelvin. Here it's at 9 Kelvin, for example. It's an extremely unusual behavior. Initially, that you increase voltage, the current increases. But after a certain point, you see that you increase voltage, the current increases, but the corresponding potential drop doesn't increase. It shows a back kind of negative kind of slope. So the negative resistivity. You can see that the typical Ohm's law that we usually apply in a material is violated. So why this is happening? Normally what happens that if you have a material like metals, think of this kind of scenario. So you have this is an array of atoms, and electron can move in this. So you have a lot of electrons at the Fermi level and they can move. Now if you have small distortion, so in the solid, so that the periodicity changes, so this can change your electronic structure because initially your energy band this is energy as a function of momentum you have plotted. Looks like this. Now since the periodicity changes from A to twice A because of this distortion here. So because now the separation is not same, so this element atom is similar to this, and again this one is similar to this. So your Brillouin zone boundary shifts from pi by A to pi by 2A, and a gap opens up. So this gives you an energy gap. So normally if you have a charge density wave system where the electron density is actually not uniform all through the lattice, but it shows a periodicity, or if you have a spin, moments align in certain fashion, that changes the periodicity of the lattice. Then what happens that because of this periodicity, a gap creates and the electrons, they become somewhat bound and behave like an insulator. So now if you apply a voltage, external voltage, this voltage can help the electron overcome this binding. It's like a latent heat that you have when you are heating a system. So in this kind of scenario, because some of the voltage is used up to release the electrons which get bound by this kind of charge density wave or spin density wave. Okay, so this kind of things, you can have that like the resistivity behavior that we have. But BaIROC is an insulator. So insulator means you don't have electrons at the Fermi level. So if that is the case, so then this material already is insulating, so it should not show this kind of behavior. So why it is so? So we have studied this using high resolution spectroscopy. And what we find out is that using extreme high resolution, we find out that although this is an insulator, at room temperature, you can see that there is a finite intensity at the Fermi. Unless you have a density of, good resolution, you cannot really find out or probe this kind of electrons. For example, normally if you have a silver, you know at low temperature, this looks like this. And if you increase temperature, the distribution becomes different because of the Fermi-Dirac distribution function. This you do it from experiment. You can find out beautifully from the experiment this Fermi-Dirac distribution functions. The same thing could be found in this material also. But although it's an insulator, but you have some electrons there at the Fermi level. And these electrons gives you all insulating behavior because they're localized. It's a one-dimensional system, and you can localize them by any kind of disorder or impurities and so on. So it's an insulator, but there are some density of states. So now, since you have density of states, this can give you a density wave kind of scenario, and you can get this kind of behavior. So this is one kind of thing that we have found out. The other kind of example that I can give you is that nowadays many materials are found. As you know, that if you want to have a magnet, so you need to have a magnetic element like iron, cobalt, nickel, or some rare earths like cerium, gadolinium, and so on. So if you have these kind of elements inside the material, it gives you magnetism. Okay. But nowadays people have found out that many materials, you don't have any magnetic element, but still it shows magnetic behavior. This has been found out by, many compounds have been found out by many groups. I have listed some of them. Professor Rao has contributed, has found many such materials. If you look at, say, nano kind of nanomaterial of a small size, that also gives ferromagnetic behavior, although there is no magnetic element, like zinc oxide, magnesium oxides, and so on. I'll give you one example, calcium hexaboride, CaB6. You have boron, you have calcium, none of them are magnetic, but if you do magnetization measurement, it shows a finite hysteresis. So why it shows this kind of behavior? So we have done photoemission measurements, and as you know, that if you want to get magnetic moment, so the spin of the electrons has to be visible. Okay. Now, if you have extremely good metal like, say, sodium, so alkaline metal, earth metal, or alkali metals, and so on. So if the electrons are highly mobile, distributed all over the solid, so their spin is not well defined anymore because the contribution of the electronic state is equal at every side. Okay, so the spin gets distributed, and Pauli's exclusion principle ensures that you have equal number of upspin and downspin states. Okay, so that way the magnetism becomes destroyed. Now, if you have a local electrons like and all the energy band is not completely filled, then you can get a magnetism, which happens for 3D elements or 4D transitional metal elements or rare earth compounds and so on. So basically, you need to have localized electrons so that its spin becomes accountable for the magnetic moment. Okay, so that's basically the underlying physics for a magnetic material. So here I see that boron 2p electrons, which constitutes the valence band, and it's not supposed to give you magnetic moment because it's 2p orbitals that are highly mobile. And but if we do photoemission spectroscopy, we see that you get a contribution. These are quantum mechanical state, so they have some amount of itineracy, like the Fermi Dirac function that you have, and also there is some component which shows local character. So these 2p electrons actually behave like the electrons in other materials. Why it should behave that way? Because as you know that any material that we fabricate, although they are supposed to be a good crystal, but it's extremely difficult to get a perfectly pure crystal without any defect or impurity. So this is impossible because nature doesn't allow it so much. So you will always bound to have some kind of a impurity site or vacancies and so on. And the moment you have this vacancy, then the electrons which are there, which are moving inside the solid, get scattered by them, and you have a local moment gets created because the electrons are no more freely mobile like it used to have in a pure solid or perfect solid. Okay, so that gives you magnetism. So this is called p electron ferromagnetism that we have discovered in this kind of materials. Okay. The other example that I want to give you is topological insulators, which has been studied extensively in these days. So this is a very, very special kind of material where the bulk of the material is like a simple insulator, like ceramic material. So you have a conduction band, you have a valence band, and there is an energy gap. And this electron in the valence band that cannot be excited so easily to the conduction band, so you don't have electronic conduction. So in the bulk, it's like this, you have valence band and conduction band, there is a gap. But the electrons which are there at the surface, so they are somehow mobile for some reason. Not only that, the electrons which are moving in one direction, if it has a up spin, for example, so this red line, the electrons which are moving in the reverse direction has a down spin. Okay. So this is a special kind of scenario. As you know, that momentum is basically a derivative of space with respect to time. So the distance by time. Now, if you reverse the time, t becomes minus t, the momentum becomes minus, say, negative of that, minus k, okay? Because dx dt is negative there. So that means if you reverse the time, the momentum gets reversed. And since spin is also a momentum, that should also get reversed. So that means that if you have a system, like if you have a movie which is running in forward time, the way you look at it, if you move the same movie in the reverse time, in the backward direction, and if the movie or the picture that you are seeing gives you the similar kind of representation, then you say that this movie is having time reversal symmetry. Similarly, in a material, where your electron moves in this direction, if you have an up spin, now you reverse the time, then the electrons start moving in the other direction, but the spin is really down spin. Then you say that the time reversal symmetry is maintained in this material. So topological insulators are those kind of special materials where there is time reversal symmetry. Means that if the electron on the surface moves in one direction and it has a up spin, then the electrons which are moving in the other direction must have down spin. You cannot have a up spin electron moving in the other direction. The speciality is that if an electron moves in the forward direction with up spin, and if you have impurity, this electron cannot get scattered by that, because if it wants to get scattered and moves in the other direction, its spin also has to be flipped, which is not possible in various scattering processes, spin flip. So that way, the impurities cannot really scatter this electron. So this is the speciality of this. The electron moves in one direction, keep on moving, whatever you do inside the solid. So these are very special kind of materials where the bulk is insulating, surface is metallic, and you have a time reversal symmetry. You can also have crystal symmetry like mirror symmetry maintained, and these are called crystalline insulators. These materials are studied extensively these days. And if you want to study them, photoemission spectroscopy is the only technique by which you can characterize them easily. Okay? The other methods cannot tell you this time reversal symmetry and other properties. So what we have also studied extensively, and you see that this Bi to Ac3 is one kind of technique where you can look at, and I can tell you interesting behavior that, as I just now said, that these electrons cannot be perturbed by anything that we do on the surface because there is a time reversal symmetry maintained. But you know that you break a sample and do your experiment, you can see that the spectrum are very different. You have a valence band like this and conduction band like this scenario, and inside that you have a surface states, but their picture is different for different kind of cleaving. So it really depends on the chemical environment that we have talked about it extensively. Then I think I'll not go into the details. We are also looking at iron-based superconductors extensively. But what I would like to tell at the end, I mean, there are a lot of games people are playing, like, for example, these electrons, these are called Dirac fermions, because, you know, the dispersion that you see, they show this linear kind of dispersion. I just wanted to mention one thing is that graphene has been studied extensively these days, where you also see this linear dispersion, but there this time reversal symmetry is not maintained. So you have Dirac fermions, but they need not be a topological insulator. Why they are called Dirac fermions? Because you see that the energy is linearly proportional to the momentum. This cannot happen unless you have this relativistic equation is maintained, like E square equal to P square C square plus M0 square C to the power 4. Now, if you have M0, the rest mass is 0, then you have E square equal to P square C square. P is the momentum, so E is linear in P. Okay, so that's the way you get this linear kind of dispersion. And since the M0, which is the rest mass of the particle, is 0, so these kind of particles are very special, and they are called Dirac particles. And a lot of things which are happening these days, I'll not go into the details of this. One can actually create quantum wells, like say, you have a glass, for example, and deposit some films and study the confinement effect. So there are different kind of confinements that we have studied. And so here, by photon emission, you can see that how the quantum well states actually depends on the thickness, and their properties can be found out. So the last example that I want to give you is time-resolved photoemission spectroscopy. Okay, and then I'll close this. So far I have talked about how to determine the momentum, how to determine energy, how to determine symmetry, and how to learn various electronic properties using those techniques. You can also determine the lifetime of the electrons that you are exciting by using this palm probe method. So, for example, you have a laser, you use part of it and excite the system, and then use another part of the same laser and study at a different time what is the state of that. So, for example, I have used a laser titanium sapphire where the energy is 1.5 electron volt, and excite the system. And after a few femtoseconds, I use another beam which has a different energy. I can use the same energy, but for photon emission, you need to have photon energy more than its work function, which is about 4 to 5 electron volt. So I can use a different photon energy at a different time and see the electronic structure and study the electronic structure at a different delay time. That gives you that how many electrons are there at the excited state at a different delay time. So this gives you a very, very interesting scenario. I'll tell you one of them here. So here, this x-axis is the delay time. So what we have done, we have used a polarized light and tried to see the relaxation of these excited state electrons. Now we can use a light where the polar electric vector is polarized along one of the lobe and excite those electrons and see its relaxation. So that way, so this polarization gives you the relaxation of dxz and dyz electrons. This polarization gives you the relaxation of dxy electrons. This can be done by symmetry selection rules. And we see that the time scale of the relaxation of different electrons are very different. Not only that, you see that there are different oscillations which are there in our relaxation time. These oscillations actually tells you the vibrations of atoms. So you know that if two atoms, they vibrate with each other, their hybridization will change with time. So if the hybridization changes, the electronic structure will change, the population at a particular energy will change, and that fluctuation can be proved. So this way you can actually find out what is the frequency of oscillation, and from that, this if the electron is coupled to a particular momentum or the lattice vibration or not, that you can find out. And you can actually see what kind of electrons has what kind of lifetime and so on. So this gives you a lot of physics of the material. I'm not going into the details. So here, this example that shows that since you are able to excite electrons selectively, like for example, if you can excite dxy electrons without exciting other electrons, so you can find out or probe the properties associated to dxy electrons without disturbing the other electrons. This is impossible by any other things. For example, if you want to heat a system, there is no way you can heat the system of one type of electrons without disturbing others. Like if you just heat, the total temperature becomes higher and everything gets excited. There is no way you can distinguish excitations of various kind of objects present in the material. So here we have discovered a methodology by which you can actually distinctly separate out various excitations and probe their properties and see if the properties that you have, like for example, magnetic order, superconductivity and so on, they are linked to each other or not. So those kind of behavior that can be studied. Okay, so that's a very new method that we have discovered recently, And I hope this will be very popular because in the future. Thank you very much for your attention. So now, if you have any question, please let me know. I will be happy to answer.
We have few questions already.
Yeah, please tell me.
It is by Chinmay Shukla, one of our students. Sir, can this happen that two techniques contradict each other, verdict on compound or element or molecule? Also, can it happen that due to structural hindrance, even at enough energy of an electron might not excite?
Sorry, can you please read the question again?
Yeah, there are multiple questions here. Sir, yeah. Can this happen that two techniques contradict each other's verdict on a compound or element or molecules? This is question number one.
Yes, yes, maybe I can answer that. Okay, maybe you can say the other one by one.
Yeah, also can it happen that due to structural hindrance, even at enough energy on electron might not excite?
Yes, okay. Yeah, both I can, I understand the two questions. Okay, first of all, that if you determine the, for example, the composition of a compound, whether different methods can it give consistent description. I mean, this is one very important thing that one has to really worry about when you are finding out an element. Most of the time, if you want to find out the composition of a compound, people use the most used technique is one of the most used technique is called EDAX, energy dispersive analysis of X-rays, the X-ray emission technique. Okay, but then this EDAX also is not sensitive to all. For example, if you have a lighter element like carbon and oxygen, you cannot find out their amount very accurately. So, but heavier elements, it can give you a good kind of estimation. But XPS, when you are doing, XPS is not really so much problematic in that sense because it's an element specific technique. So if you have some element present, you can definitely find out the presence of the element by XPS. Now XPS has a problem, as I said, that how much element is present, what would be the exact composition. This one cannot say very accurately because the simple thing is that the photoemission cross-section plays a significant role, and there is this penetration depth dependence. So you are not able to probe the bulk of the material so efficiently, like in the EDAX. I mean, if you have a very high energy technique, so where you can probe the bulk of the material, or you can use transmission methods like imaging and so on. There you can also try to find out the composition. So basically, I would say that different technique has a possibility of giving you different results, but you also have to know that each and every technique has its limitations. So we have to keep that in mind and use all of them judiciously to find out what will be the exact. So you basically have to combine various techniques and find out what will be the exact composition of an unknown material. Okay. Instead of sorry, the contradicting things that you have. Now the second question, if you have an extremely compact material, so whether the electron can be completely blocked. As I said, that photoemission technique is a quite surface sensitive technique. Now, if you have, for example, rare earth based materials where the heavier elements actually can block electrons or scatter electrons very efficiently, so there the effective penetration depth is few angstrom, like top 1 or 2 layers. First of all, the top layer cannot be blocked, of course, because you know it's the surface and the electrons get excited, there is nothing to stop it. Okay? The second layer, even if you compact it as much as possible, you will always have some possibility of some electrons coming out. So some fraction of the electrons will come out, but it will depend on the compactness of the material. So that's the reason even if you make the same material, the escape depth may not be same. It depends on the density of the material that you have prepared. Okay? So that has to be kept in mind. So your question is really important. And when you are looking at the escape depth, you have to worry about the compactness of the material of the system. Okay? Yeah. Next question, please. I can see from the chat, there is Prashant Karmukar. He said, is it possible to determine the mean free path of photoelectron spectra? Okay, so this is correct. Actually, all the mean free path that I have shown are actually determined from the photoemission spectrum only. So you essentially, there are different ways to do that. You can actually use the angle dependence and make the technique sensitive to different layers and find out the, or if you have layered materials, having different elements at different layers, you can determine it. But all the escape depth that I have shown, they are all actually determined experimentally. So that universal curve that I have shown. Yeah. Any other question, please? I can't hear you. Somehow, Dr. Chakraborty, I can't hear you. Is your mic?
Remove your headphone, please. Remove your headphone.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, I can hear. Yeah.
Yeah. Sir, please explain again how Brillouin zone measured by spectroscopy.
Okay, so this, yeah, I can show you that. So normally what happens is that this is very easy experimentally. So I told you that you can determine the energy, the kinetic energy of the electron and its momentum in a R-phase spectrum. Okay. So what you do is that you do the experiment at different angle and find out the corresponding momentum. Now, if you plot this energy or the binding energy of the electron as a function of momentum, you will see that at some point the energy band will fold back. For example, it was dispersing in this way and then it comes back. Now, when you reach the Brillouin zone boundary, that's the high symmetry point, the bands actually reflects back. This is true if you look at any of the band structure. So you can find out where the bands are actually bending back. That gives you the boundary. So that's the Brillouin zone boundary. And that's the way, if you have a spin density wave or charge density wave system, where the Brillouin zone boundary actually shifts from 1K value to its half or some other value. So you can actually determine by doing this band dispersion. So first of all, when there is no spin density wave or charge density wave, you just look at the boundary what it is, and then you go to the temperature where you have this density wave set up and look at again the zone boundary, and you will see that this zone boundary has shifted. Or if there is a gap, of course, opened up, then you don't have the Fermi surface. So then, of course, you don't need to worry about the dispersion at the Fermi level. Of course, you have the bands at higher energies. Fermi surface won't be there, but the bands will be bending back at the zone boundary.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody has any question?
Finding out zone boundary is very easy. Yeah. Please tell me.
Yeah. Anybody has any question further? I have one question.
Yeah. Please tell me.
Yeah. You have talked about time resolved photo emission spectroscopy. Can this spectroscopy technique can be used on carbon materials like soft carbon materials like graphene or carbon?
Yes.
Quantum dots.
Yeah. These are used. I mean, if you want to study the relaxation time and various dynamics, so in the electron dynamics of the system, you can use it very efficiently. Nowadays, people are, I mean, it's becoming more and more popular these days because if you want to understand the electronic properties, it's very important to know the dynamics of the system. And that can be studied by time results.
Thank you. If there is no question further, Let me check.
Okay.
No further questions from any attendees. So I thank you, Professor Maiti, for giving a wonderful, really wonderful, extensive lecture and making us aware of the work and making us aware all the knowledge, etc. We learned a lot from your lecture. And
Thank you.
just a request, when you visit Delhi and nearby in future, because now pandemic is going on, so when you visit Delhi, please let us know, and we'll invite you to visit our campus in Noida.
Sure,
Stay
sure.
on half a day with us, see all of our labs and all the facilities, and interact with our students. Our students will be mostly benefited by your presence in our campus.
It will be my pleasure. Yeah.
Again, thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thank you.
So
Yeah.
we'll
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.